William Saroyan, Paul Bowles, and Opera. There is little doubt that William Saroyan was one of the most connected people of the middle portion of the 20th century. His correspondences range from figures in the arts, music, writing, people like Katharine Hepburn, Ed Sullivan, Flann O'Brien, John Cheever. Often within a few exchanges, one or the other in the exchange would bring up the possibility of a collaboration. These collaborations sometimes bore fruit, but some of the most impressive of all Saroyan's work came about because of these interactions, although sometimes they did not. Paul Bowles is one of the most fascinating cultural figures of the 20th century. Like Saroyan, he was a relentless creator, and not willing to confine his creativity to a single area. Bowles was a writer, composer, translator. He may best be known for his years in Tangier, where he wrote and acted as a historian of indigenous music there. Before that, though, he was one of America's true gifts, a prodigy at both music and poetry. He was publishing work before he was a teenager. His writings, at times surrealistic and full of modernist sentiment, stood in many of the most important publications of the day alongside many of the other important figures of the time. Bowles studied with Aaron Copland, perhaps the most well-known American composer of orchestral music in the first third of the 20th century. The two became lovers and together moved between Paris and New York. At the urging of Gertrude Stein, the two visited Tangier for the first time in 1931. After returning to New York, he began to create music for the stage. Though never fully trained as a composer, his work with Copland and later Virgil Thomson was informal, and the two of them had urged Bowles to get more formal training. Despite this, many directors, producers, and choreographers sought out Bowles as a collaborator. These included some of the biggest names in theater, such as Tennessee Williams and Orson Welles. There were few names bigger than William Saroyan in the late 1930s. He had exploded onto the scene in the release of The Daring Young Man on the Flying Trapeze and Other Stories, and then made just as big a splash on the Broadway scene in 1939 with the release of My Heart's in the Highlands, and later, The Time of Your Life. Even prior to his first plays being performed, he was already in demand by media organizations, looking for content, and in 1937, that content was radio. Bowles was friends with photographer and writer Dorothy Norman, who was a regular correspondent with Saroyan at the time. Norman and Saroyan interacted in cards and letters, and it was likely in one of those letters between Saroyan and Norman that he mentioned he was working on a radio piece. In June of 1937, Bowles wrote to Saroyan for the first time. Dear Mr. Saroyan, Dorothy Norman has suggested that I get in touch with you regarding the music that might be necessary for a play of yours, which she says may be given to CBS. If you do need such music at any time, send me the script a while beforehand. While many of Saroyan's pen pals would become collaborators, Bowles may be the first to contact Saroyan specifically for the purpose of collaboration. He had already scored work for Orson Welles during this period, when he worked with the Federal Theater Project, a part of the WPA. He also appeared to have a love-hate relationship with that sort of work. The thing is, Bowles said in a letter to Saroyan, I'm itching to get to work at something really serious and meaty and exciting, and not just another incidental score, in between furnishing music by the yard. You've got to call on yourself for spontaneous, personal inspiration once in a while, or you dry up. Thus began their correspondence, and shortly thereafter, Bowles was asked to provide music for My Heart's in the Highlands. The details of exactly how I happened to be assigned the composition of the score for My Heart in the Highlands aren't clear in my mind, Bowles noted in a letter to David Batten in 1981. My suspicion is that Ilya Kazan, who was then part of the group theater, approached me. He later added, Saroyan and I had been corresponding shortly before the group theater decided to present the play, and it's possible that he was partially instrumental in making the decision. Bowles provided music to several other Saroyan productions, notably Love's Old Sweet Song. Bowles worked largely at creating incidental music for stage, was restless to get onto more challenging work. He wanted to create an opera. While this period of Bowles' career was defined by his theatrical music, he yearned not only to create operatic music, but to collaborate closely on the form with a librettist. In a letter from July 21st, 1941, Bowles made this pitch to Saroyan. What would really be ideal would be a real collaboration of the kind we did in Love's Old Sweet Song, whose songs I still very much like, including the one published separately this spring. Those lyrics were perfect. But if you remember, they were the result of actual collaboration, which always goes a long way towards making good prosody and song. Saroyan had already proven himself a master of the theatrical form, and the collaboration on Love's Old Sweet Song had proven fruitful. While Bowles had already composed an opera, Denmark Vesey, in 1937 with a libretto by Charles Henry Ford, and in 1941 was soloing on writing both music and libretto on The Wind Remains, based on a play by Federico Garcia Lorca. Saroyan, on the other hand, had never written an opera, but had certainly considered it. The idea of writing an opera is an old one with me, he wrote in the introduction of his piece Opera Opera in 1940, but so far has gone unfulfilled. The piece is metatextual, damn near postmodernist in approach. It references the tropes of opera while not itself being an opera. The piece is largely a comical farce, but certainly played to a non-operatic audience who thought they knew what opera was all about. Of the play, Bowles said, Opera Opera, I think is swell, but I feel it's a tad short, and is rather a ballet with a few songs than an opera. What Bowles had in mind was a more or less traditional opera. A one-act opera in which the characters speak, sing, recite the music, dance, and act, and do other damned thing you can think of, but where we have real songs that will enable us to call it an opera. Both men were busy on many projects, but the idea was strong. Bowles seemed to understand Saroyan's tremendous level of output. I know you work like a whirlwind, and a composer can't, but a short time of real collaboration makes for the disparity of in-tempo, and helps weld the two instruments into one. There is no doubt that both men were excited by the project, but perhaps Bowles slightly more than Saroyan. Bowles ended his July 21st letter with, "If you are in New York and busy, still let me know if and when you'll feel like making the great American opera, and I'll be there." As often happened when collaborators work at a distance, the progress was difficult to measure. The two appear to have communicated through letters primarily. At the time, Bowles lived in Jalisco, Mexico, while Saroyan was alternately in New York, San Francisco, or Los Angeles. The letters between the two are fascinating, not only for the discussion of the work, but because of the view of the everyday lives of the two in that portion of the 20th century. Saroyan had just moved on to working on Jim Dandy, which ended up a failure in tryouts, never making it to Broadway. The same was true for Sweeney and the Trees. Bowles had been contacted about providing music for both. Bowles wrote extensively about his health woes. Saroyan wrote about his issues with Pat Winters and the difficulties of working in New York and Hollywood. And of course, they talked about the project. Naturally, a tremendous part of the opera will have to be added by the director. I am writing set numbers, songs, dance sequences, etc. I noticed for the player piano, you have chosen the same piece we used in Love's Old Sweet Song. I'd like to use the same orchestral result of that, which was thrown out in Philadelphia, if I remember. Things were sporadic, apparently, but an interval of roughly a month passing between, with no news. Saroyan sent a message to Bowles. Dear Paul, I'm not sure if this letter will reach you, but I am eager to hear how the music for Opera Opera is working out, if at all. Please let me know. I hope you are well now, and that you are working. The response, written 2 weeks later, was rather emphatic. I'm glad you wrote to see how Opera Opera is, because it's dead. I struggled for 2 months with it and wrote a good deal of music for it, and I noticed as I worked I was never really ready to tackle anything vocal. This was the end of Opera Opera, at least as far as Bowles was concerned. As Bowles noted in his 1981 letter to Patan, Opera Opera was the same project as the Alphabet Opera Bill sent me in Mexico. I don't feel it was the right libretto for me, and our correspondence came to an end. Saroyan appeared to have moved on, creating a great amount of work in the early years of the 1940s, though his time in the military both slowed his meteoric rise and changed the timbre of his work. Bowles would keep working in music throughout the rest of his life. By the end of the 1940s, he had transitioned to focusing on prose. He moved to Tangier full-time in 1947, making his primary residence until his death in 1999. His home in Tangier became almost a point of pilgrimage for beat writers of the 1950s, with various authors and poets of the movement, including Allen Ginsberg and Gregory Corso. In 1958, the Rockefeller Foundation funded an ethnomusicology project for Bowles to document Moroccan music, which would become the core of a major collection at the Library of Congress. The fascinating thing is that this was not the end for Opera Opera. In 1956, composer Mountain Kalmanov inquired of Saroyan about creating an actual opera out of his theatrical work, Opera Opera. In the introduction of the opera's publication, Kalmanov said, "It is hoped that this spoof of the old school of opera in the grand style will not offend anyone, since it was meant good-naturedly." While the score and whatever libretto Bowles created is gone today, the legacy of the Bowles-Saroyan collaboration still remains. While many of the scores Bowles created for the stage have been lost, 3 songs created by the pair have survived. A Little Closer, Please, the Pitchman song from My Heart's in the Highlands, and The Years and Of All the Things I Love both survive today in voice and piano versions. These songs were created deeply in their collaboration, and makes one wonder what would have been possible if they had kept at it with Opera Opera. Special thanks to the University of Delaware Library for providing letters between Paul Bowles and William Saroyan.